I'm turning 18 in a few weeks, and I'm supposed to start college in 2 months. I got accepted into my first choice about a month ago, and I was thrilled about it. They have a great microbiology program, which is what I'm interested in. Unfortunately, my excitement only lasted until my parents told me that they couldn't afford to send me there, and I had to pick my safety school instead because that was closer to home and would cost them a lot less. I got into an argument with them over it because it felt really awful that they told me to apply to whichever college I wanted to, but now that it was time to talk about the tuition, they were singing a different tune and were claiming not to have enough money to be able to afford the college I wanted to go to. My dad's a software engineer and my mom's the head of sales at a company, and we live comfortably. So I didn't understand why exactly they were being such misers when it came to my education. I didn't even have siblings that they had to worry about, and to be fair, the tuition was well within their budget. It just seemed unfair to me at the time, but they insisted that they'd go broke paying my tuition and wouldn't be able to save enough to retire. My parents are just in their early 40s, so I don't know what retirement they're talking about because they still have a good 20 or even more years to go. I argued with them over this for several days, and I tried everything from anger to begging and even bargaining, because I said that if they funded my education at the college of my choice, then I'd pay the full amount back to them eventually, and they wouldn't have to suffer any losses. They didn't give a damn and instead told me to start looking into student loans instead of wasting my time by arguing with them, or simply give up and go to my safety school instead. I wasn't too keen on the idea of taking a loan because of the risk involved, but after arguing for about a week, I realized that my parents were determined not to give me the money for some reason, and fighting for it would be futile. So I could either go to my safety school and give up on my dream college, or else I could take out a loan and then end up with a ton of debt like so many others, and both the possibilities seemed super bleak to me. I kept researching loans and their pros and cons, and I also applied for a scholarship, but I didn't give up hope. I did give up talking to my parents after our fight, though, because they were being selfish and I just couldn't bring myself to forgive them for it. My parents and I have always had a strained relationship at best, because both of them were working individuals and were the kind of people who brought their work home with them. It was mostly my grandparents, my dad's parents. My mom's parents passed away before I was born, looking after me and taking care of me while I was a child, and once I was old enough to be home by myself, they'd leave me alone for hours while they were out for work. Even when they came back home, they weren't particularly interested in me and would only do the bare minimum. They'd talk to me at meals sometimes and ask me about school and my friends, but I could always tell they weren't interested, and I wouldn't try to talk to them either because it just seemed pointless. I'm going to be blunt and just say it. To me, my parents were nothing more than people who paid for things that I needed and would let me live with them. It sounds harsh and makes me seem like a total selfish brat, but you can't really blame me because it was my parents who never really bothered to make an emotional bond with me. And as a kid, I tried to get their attention and win them over, but I never could, so I gave up trying after a while since it was clearly pointless. As long as I had a roof over my head, clothes to wear, and food to eat, I was good. They'd sent me to a decent school, I had good grades, and now I wanted to go to a reputed college so I could land a well-paying job after it. They were going to pay for it because I knew they had that sort of money, and that was the way it was supposed to be. That's the way it has always been. I didn't expect my parents to shower me with love and affection or even tell me that they were proud of me because of what I'd achieved, but I did expect them to fund my education at the very least because that's the one area where they hadn't let me down yet. But unfortunately, now they'd failed as parents there as well. I'm not saying this because they refused to pay for my education, but because about 2 weeks ago I found out that they were paying for my cousin's education instead. My dad has an older brother and they have a son who's the same age as I am. He's starting college around the same time, and we do have a couple of friends in common. One of these common friends sent me a picture that my cousin had posted, a picture with my parents who were smiling broadly while hugging him. In the caption of that picture, he thanked my parents for agreeing to sponsor his education and pushing him to chase after his dreams. My cousin had probably blocked me at my parents' request since I couldn't see his profile at all. I hadn't even noticed because he and I weren't close. My friend wasn't aware of my situation and had just sent that screenshot to me to tell me how kind and generous my parents were. She had no clue that they were also really horrible and were putting their own daughter's dreams and ambitions aside just to be able to fuel someone else's. On one hand, they claimed that they couldn't afford to send me to the college of my choice, but they had absolutely no issues sponsoring my cousin's education. And he was attending a college that was a lot more expensive than mine, so the things they told me just didn't add up at all. It also made no sense that his father wasn't paying for his tuition because my uncle was a high school teacher at a private school and made enough money to be able to provide for his son. Or at least I think he does, because judging by their house, they don't live too shabbily, and I'm sure they can afford it if they want to. His mom's not in the picture anymore, but they do co-parent him, and she's a journalist as far as I know. So it's definitely not about the money for them. My parents weren't at home when I found out, as usual, and I wanted to confront them about it, but I was so pissed off that I decided to go to my grandparents first instead. I share a good relationship with my grandparents, but I hadn't told them anything about what I was going through because my grandma was kind of sick and I didn't want to be a burden on them. They were reasonably well off and had retired a couple of years back after handing over the reins of their textile business to my great uncle. It had been the three of them running the business earlier, but my grandparents chose to retire once they hit 60. My great uncle was still in his mid-50s and had no intention of retiring for a while since he had no family and only wanted to work and travel. All of them still earned well from the business they'd set up together. But my parents had never relied on them for money and had taught me never to take money from them either. I never needed to anyway, so I was okay with it and didn't question it back then. My grandparents had always been very kind to me and had made me feel loved, which was a nice change of pace from the kind of treatment I was used to at my parents' place, so I'd visit them frequently in the past. Unfortunately, about a year ago, my grandmother was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and then it became kind of difficult for her to do the things she always used to do. So I stopped visiting as much as I used to because, like I already said, I didn't want to be a burden on them. This time, though, I couldn't just sit back and take this sort of bullcrap from my parents and my cousin because it was very obvious that they'd all teamed up against me for some reason. They were sabotaging my chances of going to the college I wanted to on purpose, or at least that's what it looked like to me, and I couldn't just let that happen to me. So I headed over to my grandparents' place within an hour of finding out, and they welcomed me quite happily. I'd gone back to visit them after almost 2 months, and seeing them again made me regret not keeping in touch with them, because both of them looked like they'd missed having me around. They looked thrilled to have me back, and that felt reassuring, so without wasting much time, I told them about what I'd found out. Even while narrating what had happened to them, I could feel the anger surging because it was all just so unfair. My cousin's grades weren't even as good as mine, and yet for some reason they'd chosen to sponsor him over their own daughter, and they'd even tried to cover it up. So had it not been for that one friend of mine, I might never have found out about their lies at all, and they would have been totally fine with it as well. After I was done telling my grandparents what had happened, they comforted me because I'd started crying while telling them about what I'd been going through. Both of them looked grim and just told me to go home, pack my clothes and any other important belongings, and then come back here. I was puzzled at their instructions, but honestly, I was sick of living in a house where I wouldn't speak to my parents and they wouldn't speak to me either, so I agreed without another word. At least earlier, my parents would try to talk to me, even if it was meaningless small talk. But now that was all over, and we just pretended that we were invisible to one another, which is awful. So I went back home, got my things, came back to my grandparents' place where they told me that my tuition would be taken care of by them and that I had nothing to worry about. I didn't understand what they'd done at the time, but I was just relieved that they'd found out a way to cover the expenses, because I really would have been devastated had I not been able to attend the college of my choice. I was worried about my grandparents' financial state, though, because they were both retired. And since my grandmother would have to go to the hospital for medical checkups quite frequently, the hospital bills were bound to be quite high. I didn't want to cause them unnecessary trouble in any way, so I offered to work my way through and they'd only need to cover half of my expenses. That way, but they laughed it off and dismissed it, saying that they had enough money and that I didn't need to worry about them. I wanted to know how exactly they'd pay for everything when they were retired, but I didn't want to push any further, and I didn't ask more. I hadn't told my parents anything before I left, so I had expected to hear from them when they found out that I wasn't at home. So I had indeed been expecting a call from them once they'd come back home from work, and just as I'd predicted, they reached out to me a little after dinner time. I'll be honest, I'd expected them to be upset with me because I'd left without telling them anything, and I'd wanted them to be worried for me. It's petty and makes me sound like an attention seeker, but I'd just really wanted them to call me out of concern and ask me about my whereabouts so I could finally tell them off about what kind of horrible parents they'd been to me, and then they'd finally feel sorry about what they'd done. Unfortunately, none of it materialized, because instead of a phone call from my concerned parents, all I received was a text from them telling me how incredibly disappointed they were in me, and that they never even wanted to see me again, much less speak to me. Those were the very first lines of the message, and that threw me off because I hadn't been expecting it at all. But it got even worse as I continued reading their message. Apparently my uncle had lost his teaching job a couple of weeks ago for insubordination. They didn't elaborate more, but I'm guessing it must have been something big enough for him to get fired, since he was a pretty qualified man. His ex-wife is getting remarried in a few months, so she wasn't willing to cover the cost of her son's college tuition either. And with all the bills and other household expenses, my uncle just couldn't afford to send my cousin to the college he wanted to go. There had been a lot of outrage on my cousin's part when he got to know this, and had been threatening to run away from home, so my parents had stepped in and offered to sponsor him instead. He was planning to major in art, and so it was even more risky for my uncle to invest in his degree, because it was unlikely that he'd be able to repay him soon after college. I'm not throwing shade at art majors, but just being realistic, and that was why my father believed that it would be better for them to pay for his education instead. They said that the reason they'd chosen to sponsor him over me was because he was more in need of it, while I could still get by with loans and such, and he couldn't. I don't know how much of that was true, but that was what they told me. And the reason they were texting me to let me know was because earlier that day, presumably around the time that I'd left to collect my belongings and bring them to my grandparents' house, my grandparents had called my parents and told them that they were cutting all of them out of their will, and all of it would go to me instead, since they decided to choose my cousin over me. That was why my parents were furious at me for telling my grandparents what they'd done instead of discussing it with them first, which I guess might be a fair point. I don't know if they have a point or not, to be really honest, but I do think that what they did was still kind of messed up. I understand that this was coming from a place of concern for my cousin, but even then, I should have been their first choice and not my cousin. That just really hurt me, and I think anyone else in my place would have felt the same way. So when I received the text from my parents, I didn't respond to it because I didn't know what they'd expected me to say. I believe they wanted me to apologize to them and my cousin, and then prevent my grandparents from changing their will. But I didn't think that would be fair to me at all, because if anything, I'd been the one who had been wronged by them and not the other way around. A week had passed since I received that message, and I still haven't heard back from anyone in my family. I'm still living with my grandparents, and it's relatively more pleasant than living with my parents, but that text just keeps bugging me because I feel like I might have messed things up a little for everyone involved. It's true that I could have gotten by with student loans, but even my cousin could have gone that way, and yet he'd chosen not to. But I was expected to, just because he was being an immature brat who thought running away from home was a reasonable solution to his problems. I'd always known my cousin to be kind of bratty and downright annoying when he wouldn't get his way, but I'd thought he'd grown out of that behavior. Unfortunately, he hasn't, and now I've had to bear the brunt of that. I don't know if I should talk to my grandparents about the inheritance thing, though, because that's really their decision. At the same time, I don't need all that money, and I guess my parents and my uncle would need it in the future. I feel like I'm hoarding it and being cruel to them by depriving them of their inheritance and hogging it all to myself, and that I maybe should have at least talked to my parents before I came running to my grandparents to complain about what they'd done. So AITA for telling my grandparents that my parents were funding my cousin's education over mine and then taking over their entire inheritance? Before I say anything, I'd just like to thank everyone who commented on my original post. It means the world to me, since apparently now literal strangers on the internet have more compassion for me than my own family does. You guys are just really sweet to be so supportive of me. I'd also like to say that since I drew some flack for what I said about me considering my parents my source of money and nothing else, what else was I supposed to think of them when they raised me like that? I already discussed that ever since I was a kid, they'd leave me all by myself at home for hours for work, and there was barely any emotional relationship between us, so of course I couldn't see them as anything except my source of money, and that's all. And of course I still expected them to be concerned about me and worried about me when I left, because they're still my parents, and despite everything I still want some effect and validation from them, like literally any other kid does. I've had a complicated childhood, and I don't expect everyone to understand my feelings or be empathetic towards me. But some of you people need to tone down the hate. Anyway, I decided not to talk to my parents again, and even blocked them after speaking to my grandparents regarding their text. I just couldn't keep it in anymore and ended up telling them all about it like most of you had advised me to. And they told me that it was ridiculous of them to expect that I'd be okay with them paying for my cousin for whatever reason, and if my uncle needed money, then he should have come to his parents instead of his brother. But for some reason, both my dad and his brother have an insanely high ego and refuse to take any sort of money from my grandparents at all. My grandpa believes that it's because they'd had to live really frugally while growing up because their business was still in its beginning stages and they weren't making much, so their kids couldn't afford the kind of life that their friends were used to, which made them resent my grandparents because, according to them, had they just stuck to their regular jobs instead of quitting and establishing their own business, then they wouldn't have had to give up any luxuries that they'd been used to. And that in turn made them really weird about taking money from their parents. My grandma believes that the real reason that they were so uptight about borrowing money from them was because both of them were just too proud and too arrogant to admit that they needed help and would rather suffer and make their kids suffer than just ask their parents for money. Both of those theories are plausible, in my opinion. And it's not even like my grandparents would have said no if their sons had ever asked for help, because they still made decent money from their business, which was up and running really well. They could now afford to stay home and relax and let my great uncle handle it all at work, which means it's all going well for them right now and will continue to do well in the foreseeable future. They just have no real excuse as to why they picked my cousin over me, and that's the bottom line. It's been almost 2 weeks since I moved out of my parents' house. And today, after 2 whole weeks, my parents finally showed up at my grandparents' place and demanded that I come back with them. I obviously said no right away and told them that I didn't want to go back with them at all, but they refused to listen and said that they'd call the cops and have my grandparents arrested for abduction if they didn't let me go back with them. That was what made me fly off the handle entirely, and I started screaming at them at the top of my lungs about how they're the ones who should have been arrested because they're the ones who neglected me my entire childhood. They were the ones who were still putting their own brotherhood above me and couldn't be bothered to think about me just because they felt that my idiot of a cousin was going to run away for real, and that was something that justified what they did to me. I felt a lot lighter after my tirade against my parents because it felt like years and years of anger, bitterness, pain, and resentment were making their way out of my body, and it honestly felt like I was spewing poison. My mother started to cry at the same point, but they didn't leave and waited for me to stop yelling before my dad told me that he was super disappointed in the way I turned out and that he wished he'd never come back to take me with him and make things right. When I demanded an explanation as to what he meant by making things right, he told me that he'd been planning to put me in touch with a friend of his who worked at a bank and would make it easier for me to get a loan, and then I wouldn't have to worry about my tuition anymore. At that point, I was so furious that I felt like pushing my parents out of the house. His idea of making amends wasn't giving me what was rightfully mine, my college fund, but instead he believed that putting me in touch with a banker would make it all okay for me. I couldn't believe that he'd even had the audacity to say that, and I could feel another fit of rage coming on. But luckily, my grandparents asked him to leave me alone and not come back. I'd be 18 in a couple of weeks anyway, and I really didn't need their consent to live with whoever I wanted to anymore. And even if I wasn't 18, I would rather go to prison than go back to living with my parents. Their emotional unavailability and arrogance almost ruined my life once. I wasn't about to let it happen once again. They're gone now. And just to make sure they can't take any legal action against my grandparents for letting me stay here, we're also in talks with an attorney. My grandparents were sweet enough to apologize to me for not taking me away from my irresponsible parents back when I was a kid, so I wouldn't have had to face all of this in the first place. But I don't think that's their fault anyway. I'm disappointed that my parents turned out to be like this, but I can't say I'm surprised. This was always going to happen at some point. It was just a matter of when. They've let me down countless times, but now I'm not letting them do this to me anymore. We're done, and I'm finally going to be free from them now. Just experienced my first day of college, and boy, was it a great day. My parents are no longer in the picture, so it's just my grandparents, a couple of friends, and you guys who get to hear about it. Well, at least until I make a couple of new friends. I just hope that the next couple of months treat me just as well as today did. My grandparents are very proud of me, and I feel so thankful that I have such an amazing support system to back me up.